Given we had the view that we were kind of out of the woods. Joining me this afternoon is the Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg. Welcome to the program.
Nice to be with you, Patricia.
Treasurer, Australia has avoided a technical recession for now, but today's result is likely to disappear because it predated the lockdowns across New South Wales, Victoria and the ACT. How bad is it likely to get for the economy?
Well, Treasury is expecting the economy to contract by at least 2% in the September quarter. And as you say, Patricia, that reflects the fact that our two biggest states, New South Wales and Victoria, have been in sustained lockdowns. But these numbers for the June quarter at 0.7% and 9.6% through the year are actually better than what the market was expecting. And there were 29 days of lockdowns in one part or another of the country over the course of that June quarter, including across 4 of our largest states. So there were lockdowns, they did impact upon the economy, but what was pleasing in these numbers is that it was household consumption, so families going out and spending at cafes and restaurants, tourism, transport services. It was housing investment, particularly off the back of home builder. It was businesses buying new machinery and equipment, and it was strong farm GDP numbers off the back of a strong winter crop that has actually helped deliver this positive result.
Do you expect spending in the last quarter will be slightly depressed, though, not the usual bounce, because we're going to be emerging with COVID cases now that our two biggest states are living with COVID rather than eliminating or suppressing?
It's an important question. I think certainly in the September quarter, which is the one we're currently in, you will see consumption affected. Just because of the health restrictions, you can't move more freely and spend as you otherwise would. In the December quarter, as restrictions ease, I expect people to go out and spend again, because there is some $290 billion that's been accumulated on household and business balance sheets that was not there at the start of the pandemic. And I would expect that the savings ratio, so the proportion of people's income that they're actually saving, which has gone up during the pandemic but has now started to come down as restrictions eased in the June quarter, I would expect that that would continue to come down, one would hope, as restrictions ease. So a lot will depend on sticking to that plan and people being able to travel more freely across their own state and across the country.
Lockdowns can still happen according to the Doherty plan, but they're just less likely. This is a key question. Will you keep economic supports in place for those possible lockdowns, even when we're past 70%?
Well, the Doherty Institute actually used the word stringent lockdowns are unlikely. That's what they say. They do say that there will be health restrictions that will remain needed, and that could be everything from mask wearing to density limits within cafes or restaurants.
But also lockdowns are possible in the Doherty modelling after 70%.
They're possible, but in their words, they're unlikely.
So in terms of your hat, Treasurer, will you keep the economic supports there for stood-down workers, those payments in place, in case those lockdowns are needed post 70%?
I've been very clear there should be no expectations on behalf of the Premiers and the Chief Ministers that the Commonwealth would continue the scale of economic support that we currently have in place.
Well, the scale, sure, but will you step in if those targeted lockdowns are implemented by any state because it's necessary after 70% is achieved?
I wouldn't want to make that commitment right now.
Why not? Why not? Because if they're necessary, it's actually in your modelling, right? It's actually contingency allowed for in your modelling. Why not make the commitment? Because
it's important that we do stick to the plan, and if we get to those vaccination rates, if we get to vaccination rates of 70 to 80%, we're unlikely to see lockdowns. Now, we may see health restrictions, and that may impact, for example, on density limits, and there may need to be some economic support in that circumstance when people don't have the same hours of work that they otherwise did. But the scale of support that we've provided right now has been unprecedented. And with every state and territory that's gone into lockdown, we've been providing income support. And with every state and territory that has gone into lockdown, we've reached agreements on business support. And indeed, the states that have not gone into lockdown, we've agreed to reach business support. So we can't keep this level of economic support.
No, I'm not talking about this level.
Altogether.
It would obviously have to reduce because you'd have higher rates of vaccination. But in those scenarios that the Doherty modelling actually says could happen, is the federal government really going to step away and not support those people?
Well, we've supported people right throughout this pandemic. And of course, our focus is on ensuring that they can get back their lives in a COVID-safe way. So I'm not about to incentivise state premiers or chief ministers, Patricia, to go and have lockdowns. What I want to do is focus on getting out of these lockdowns, which means getting the vaccination rates up, but holding the states and the territories to account for the agreement that they reached at National Cabinet, and that's the key point. Today, we've seen 80 of our largest business organisations around the country, employing 1 million people, go out publicly and call upon federal, state and territory governments to actually stick to the plan. And that's critical. We've got to stick to the plan. Why? Because people need hope. Why? Because businesses need certainty and their ability to plan. And our level of emergency economic support has seen our debt burden rise pretty rapidly. We have committed more than $300 billion in health and economic support. It's a lot more than what the states and territories have committed to. And that is effectively, that is borrowing from future generations. So I'll be prudent. I'll obviously focus on the situation at hand, and we'll make decisions based on those circumstances when they arise.
Scott Morrison said yesterday that each state was at a different point. Karen Andrews just spoke, and she says the federal government is of the view Queensland should be open. Is that your view?
Well, certainly in accordance with the plan. And
so it shouldn't be open right now?
Well, it should be open in accordance with the plan. Their vaccination rates are below that in New South Wales and Victoria, and obviously Western Australia has also seen a slower vaccination rate. I think it's incumbent upon those governments and those public health officials in those states to drive that uptake in the vaccination rate. We've seen, obviously, New South Wales, spurred on by the lockdown and the experience that many people are going through, has seen a record number of people get the jab. That's a really good thing, and it's putting those 70 and 80% targets in sight. Queensland should open up in accordance with the plan. The same applies for Western Australia. I believe it's in their health, economic interest, and ultimately in the long-term health interests as well.
Let's talk about that national plan. You keep saying stick to the plan. That's been your line over and over again. But the plan isn't clear about opening state borders at 70%. Do you expect Queensland and WA, for instance, to open their borders when they hit 70% of vaccination, double dose, if there are thousands of cases in New South Wales?
Well, 70 to 80% is what we've been talking about in terms of the reopening.
So if there's thousands of cases in New South Wales, right, and they've hit that vaccination rate, you think they should open their border to New South Wales?
Well, it depends on what their vaccination rate is, and that's the point. I mean, that's what the Doherty modelling says. It doesn't matter if you start with 30 cases or 800 cases, you can still open up in a COVID-safe way.
Sure, but if their vaccination is at 70%, for instance, in WA, right? Yeah. You think, and there are 4,000 cases a day in New South Wales, you think they should open?
Well, I think they should be opening up between 70 and 80%.
Regardless of the case load in New South Wales, for instance?
Well, again, it will be made, the decisions will be based on the medical advice at the time, but the view expressed very explicitly in the Doherty modelling is that the country can open up when it reaches that double key of 70 to 80% in the individual jurisdictions, as well as the 70 to 80% vaccination rates across the nation as a whole. And this is the key point, Patricia. The country needs to learn to live with COVID. And the admission and the acknowledgement in Victoria today is very significant. Patrick McGorry, former Australian of the Year, noted psychiatrist, has said it's a game changer, because what it means is that the governments at the state level are recognising they can't eliminate the virus. They can suppress it, they can buy time to get the vaccination rates up, but they can't eliminate it. And Queensland and Western Australia also need to have that mentality to know that you can't keep your borders closed or you can't keep COVID out indefinitely.
Victoria is no longer going for COVID zero, and you're right, it's very significant actually. It's a big shift. In fact, the Premier says case numbers in Victoria will go up. That's the advice they have. Now, Daniel Andrews says there will be significant restrictions until vaccination rates hit levels where enough of the population can be protected. So that essentially means Victoria is headed for a long lockdown now. Do you support that?
Well, again, they'll take the decisions on their public
You've been
health
critical
orders.
of lockdowns, though. Do you think a long lockdown is what's necessary now till those vaccination rates are lifted?
Well, again, they will take the decisions in Victoria based on the medical advice that's available to them. I recognise that you do need to suppress the virus, and that does come with health restrictions, but it's always about getting the balance right, because, as I've been saying in recent days, preventing COVID and illnesses related to COVID are an important priority, but they're not the only health outcome that we need to be conscious of. We also need to be conscious of the mental health strain that lockdowns, which are very blunt instruments, have on people. And I welcome the announcement today in Victoria about playgrounds, because I think that goes to the fact that we need to live with the virus and that we need to also be conscious of the burden that's being placed on our young kids. At some ages, they're not going to be vaccinated in a hurry because that is not what's occurring with the medical advice. Between 12 and 15, they are going to be vaccinated shortly, and that's to be welcome. But keeping kids out of the classroom, where kids can't either associate with their teachers and face-to-face learning, but also with their friends, puts an enormous amount of strain. And Patricia, you've seen the numbers, I'm sure, of the increased numbers of teenagers turning up at hospital with mental health issues. In Victoria, it's more than 340 a week. That's a 163% increase on the numbers that we saw pre-pandemic. And in New South Wales, it's about a 50% increase.
There's no doubt it's alarming.
So it's a really
Treasurer,
trying time.
Yeah.
It's a really trying time.
New South Wales has given some sort of a go back to school plan. Victoria has said no return to face-to-face learning in term 3. We don't know what will happen in term 4. What's your view? If cases still keep going up, should Victoria aim to get students back into schools for term 4?
Well, my view has always been the sooner you can get kids back into school, of course, in a COVID-safe way, and that's the caveat.
And should term 4 be what they're aiming for now? Well,
you're asking me to be the Victorian government's school and medical advisor. What I will tell you, well, to be fair, you are cheekily, but what I would say to you, Patricia, is that we should be trying to get kids, and I'm sure the Victorian government's conscious of this, we should be trying to get kids back in the classroom when it's COVID safe to do so, because I do think losing more than 200 days, as kids in Victoria have lost out of the classroom, does have a massive impact on their educational outcomes as well as their mental health and well-being. And for all of us, that's a collective responsibility, and that's why I feel very passionate about this.
Do you think the curfew should go?
Well, again, that will be decisions that they'll make. I don't like curfews because, you know, I've got a great deal of inherent trust, but, you know, again, they will be decisions around public health orders that the Victorian government will make.
So you're not critical of the curfew staying?
Well, again, that will be a decision that only the state government will make and that the state government will have to be accountable for in Victoria, just as the New South Wales government is accountable for its own public health decisions and other governments in their own jurisdictions.
I think your office is grumpy. I've gone over time. Thanks, Josh.
My pleasure.
That's the Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg.